Karen stood on a blood-streaked hill, his armor dented, scorched, yet gleaming with the pride of 1,000 battles. His presence alone had kept the coalition together, alien races united not by trust or love but by the sheer terror he inspired. His people, the Draken, had always been warriors, fierce and proud, and Karen was their mightiest. He'd led them through every battle with unyielding strength, sacrificing lives without hesitation if it meant victory over the relentless threat of the Kos Veil. To him, this was duty. To the other races, it was tyranny. His eyes scanned the horizon, where waves of the Kos Veil advanced, a mass of dark, slithering forms that seemed to drink in light itself. His coalition forces, drawn from dozens of planets, braced at his command. The Kos Veil was a parasite, a relentless, mindless horde that consumed everything in its path. It took a warrior to stand against such a foe. A warrior like Karen. But somewhere between the command barked through clenched teeth, and the dark realization that his forces were barely holding, Karen sensed something shifting. He ordered reinforcements, expecting his allies to rally as they always had. But his calls were met with silence. His forces were stretched thin, and without warning, the allied ships in the sky above began to pull back. One by one, the vessels disappeared, taking with them the last chance of support. His troops glanced up, desperate and confused, but Karen refused to betray doubt. His pride forbade it. "Hold the line!" he roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. But the line was crumbling. The Draken fought to their last breath, yet they, too, began to falter as the allied forces abandoned them. Desperation clawed at him, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. But his pride was more stubborn than his fear, and he met the Kos Veil head-on. He didn't remember the exact moment he fell. His last memories were of blinding pain and chains that felt like burning metal. When he opened his eyes again, he was deep within the enemy's lair, his armor torn from him, his body weak. The Kos Veil left him there, a broken relic of a once mighty king, chained in their shadowed realm. Days blurred together as he hung in silence. He waited for rescue, expecting his people, the Draken, to break through the enemy lines. But no help came. Bitterness seeped into his thoughts. Betrayal stained his pride. After all he had sacrificed, after the unyielding resolve he had shown, his so-called allies had cast him aside as if he were no more than a stone in their path. The isolation, the quiet, gave way to anger. He cursed every alliance he'd ever made, every race that had knelt to him only to desert him when he needed them most. His pride, once a pillar of his identity, felt like poison now, thick and suffocating. And then, something strange happened. Through the haze of his bitter thoughts, he heard a faint murmur. At first, he thought it was another hallucination, a product of his dying mind. But the voices grew louder, more distinct. A language he didn't immediately recognize echoed in the gloom, spoken with a rough, almost hesitant cadence. And as the figures came into view, he realized with a jolt, they were humans. A small group of them, covered in improvised armor, had somehow slipped through the lair's defenses. He almost laughed, seeing them approach him. Humans? They were a minor race, tucked away on the galactic fringe, insignificant and soft-hearted, little more than spectators in the galaxy's grand conflicts. He'd dismissed them countless times. And yet here they were. They moved quickly, working to free him without hesitation. He was in too much pain to resist, but he couldn't stop himself from sneering at their feeble efforts. Foolish humans! Why waste your time with a dying king? One of them, a young woman with a defiant gaze, shot back. We heard what you did for the galaxy. And we don't abandon people who fought for us, no matter who they are. He fell silent, a strange sensation prickling through his exhausted mind. He wanted to laugh, but something about her words struck deeper than he wanted to admit. Don't abandon. It was a foreign concept to him, as alien as these humans. But the humans didn't seem to care about his disbelief. They were focused, determined, working with a precision and unity that belied their small numbers. Slowly, reluctantly, he felt the cold chains slip from his wrists. Even then, he expected them to turn back. Perhaps they were here for some fleeting honor or to boast of a rescue attempt. But they didn't leave. They helped him stand, one human on each side, bracing his weight with surprising strength. "We'll get you out of here," the young woman said firmly, as if she hadn't just helped a warrior king who'd once called her kind weak and useless. With each agonizing step, they led him through the twisted corridors of the Cos Vale's lair. They were watchful and careful, showing him the kind of deference he hadn't felt in ages, not out of fear, but respect. The air was thick with danger, yet they moved with an ease that astonished him. When a wave of Cos creatures appeared, they fought with unexpected ferocity, adapting quickly, communicating with signals and whispers. They didn't boast or seek his approval. They fought simply to survive, and to protect him. In his weakened state, he watched them, each small act of courage slowly chipping away at the bitterness within him. For so long, he had believed that loyalty was a function of power and fear. These humans were showing him something else entirely, something he couldn't yet name. They weren't bound by his pride or driven by the need to prove themselves as the Draken had been. Instead, they seemed almost hopeful. He struggled to make sense of it, his mind reeling not only from the pain but from the realization dawning within him. These humans, fragile, insignificant by his own measure, had dared to do what his most powerful allies would not. They had seen him in chains, broken and humbled, and had chosen not to leave him there. For the first time since his capture, a flicker of warmth bloomed in his chest. It was not pride, nor the thrill of victory. It was something else, something soft and unsettling that made him feel exposed. In their quiet determination, he saw a reflection of the strength he had always thought resided solely in conquest and dominance. These humans had come not to fight for him, not for glory or personal gain, but simply because they could not bear to leave someone to die alone. With each step, the chains around his heart grew a little lighter, and A.R. Karen, for the first time, allowed himself to lean on others, not as a king demanding loyalty, but as a warrior humbled by those he once thought beneath him. The humans' approach was quiet but intentional. They moved with the careful coordination of people who had little experience in grand, galactic battles but plenty in staying unnoticed. A.R. Karen found himself marveling at their resourcefulness. They weren't heavily armed. In fact, their weapons seemed pieced together from salvaged parts. Their armor was mismatched, clearly a patchwork of whatever they could find. And yet they pressed on with an almost naive determination. As they guided him through the corridors, one of the humans, a man with a rugged look and a slight grin, leaned over. "You know, sir," he whispered, half joking, "you don't seem all that bad. Heard you were terrifying." A.R. Karen scoffed, his voice rough from disuse. "The Cos do not tremble at jokes, human. I led the coalition because no one else could." The man didn't flinch, just shrugged. "Well, maybe terror works. But where we come from, sometimes a little kindness goes a long way." Kindness. The word lingered, uncomfortable and strange. He'd never seen it as strength. Kindness had no place in war. It was weakness, a luxury for those who never tasted battle. Yet here they were, risking themselves for him, a king who had likely scorned every one of their races. He wanted to dismiss it as foolish, but these humans seemed oddly grounded. They understood the stakes, yet they had chosen this path without hesitation. As they walked, the young woman he'd seen earlier turned to him, her face intent. "You know, we don't see this as a rescue mission. We're proving something, to ourselves, maybe to the galaxy. Humanity's always been seen as the underdog. Thought it'd be nice to change that for once." A.R. Karen watched her, intrigued despite himself. He had seen the galaxy's best warriors, its most cunning strategists, its most ruthless leaders. And here was this human, with nothing but conviction and the flimsiest of armor, standing against the dark forces of the Cos Vale. She had no reason to help him, yet there she was, treating him as if he were worth something beyond his title, beyond his power. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice thick with exhaustion and unspoken frustration. "What drives you humans to risk yourselves like this? You have nothing to gain here. Your allies abandoned me. I was nothing but a tool to them." She looked him squarely in the eyes, and there was a fierceness in her gaze he hadn't expected. Because you fought when others didn't. Maybe you weren't perfect, but you didn't just roll over. You put yourself on the line for the galaxy, and that's something we respect. Humanity doesn't leave people to die just because it's convenient. He felt something unfamiliar stir within him, a warmth that almost felt like shame. Had he been wrong? Had he mistaken his brutal leadership for strength when it was, in fact, the trust of others he had needed all along? He shook the thought away, unwilling to entertain it further. Yet, with every step, he felt his resolve softening, just a fraction. They reached a deeper part of the lair, a cavernous chamber thick with shadows, and for a moment, he saw a flicker of fear in their eyes. It was natural. The Cos Vale's presence was palpable here, a gnawing darkness that made even his Draken soldiers waver. But these humans kept moving, checking every corner, staying close to each other with a wordless understanding that struck him as almost familial. In one of the rare quiet moments, the woman told him about humanity's survival instincts, how they had developed a knack for finding hope even when things looked bleak. She described how humans, even in their darkest hours, managed to band together, and something about it sounded foreign yet strangely appealing. He had led his coalition through strength and fear. But these humans, they didn't rely on power. They relied on trust, even in moments like this, when trust seemed impossible. Karen's pride flared for a moment, a stubborn ember refusing to die. Trust makes you weak, he argued, almost reflexively. The Cos will exploit it. They consume weakness. The woman shook her head, smiling softly. Or it makes us strong. You can't win a war alone. But you've been doing it alone for so long, haven't you? Maybe you forgot what it feels like to have someone beside you. The words stung, striking somewhere deeper than he wanted to admit. Alone. She was right, of course. Karen had always kept himself at a distance from others, seeing them as tools, allies to be wielded, not trusted. And here were these humans, risking their lives for him, giving everything simply because they believed in the value of standing together, in loyalty over fear. He almost laughed, a bitter sound that echoed in the quiet darkness. You humans are strange. Too soft for your own good. Maybe, she said undeterred, but we survive. And maybe we're soft, but softness doesn't mean we don't fight when we need to. They pressed on, and Karen found himself strangely humbled, not by their strength but by their conviction. These weren't warriors by his standards, and yet they were brave in a way he couldn't quite grasp. They lacked his power, his experience, but in their eyes he saw something he couldn't name, a defiant spark that had kept them alive when the galaxy had ridden them off. When they finally encountered a swarm of Cos creatures, the humans fought with an energy that shocked him. They moved fluidly, each covering the other's back, their actions uncoordinated yet synchronized, messy but effective. They weren't afraid to make sacrifices, weren't afraid to stumble if it meant helping one another up. It was almost beautiful. As the last creature fell, one of the humans clapped him on the back, grinning as if they hadn't just faced certain death. See? Even a warrior king can learn a thing or two about teamwork. Karen didn't respond immediately. The words rolled through his mind, unsettling him. For so long, he had viewed loyalty as a tool, something to enforce through strength, never through kindness or trust. These humans, with their ragtag armor and mismatched weapons, were showing him an entirely different way to lead, a way he had never even considered. For the first time, he found himself wondering if strength wasn't measured solely by power but by the bonds one was willing to forge and maintain. He had led armies, conquered territories, held the galaxy in fear, but he had never inspired the kind of loyalty these humans showed one another. The realization hit him harder than he cared to admit, a bittersweet sensation filling his chest. Perhaps he had been wrong all along. Perhaps power wasn't the only measure of a leader. Perhaps, he thought with a strange mixture of sorrow and relief, strength lay in the connections one dared to make, in the trust one was willing to extend. As they continued deeper into the lair, Karen felt something shift within him. For the first time, he was not simply being led by these humans, he was walking alongside them, not as a warrior king, but as someone who, against all odds, was beginning to understand the power of unity. Karen moved with the humans now, more an ally than a leader, and he found himself attuned to their rhythm. Every so often, he glanced at them, these unlikely companions who had come for him without expectation. Their resolve was steady, and each time they encountered the Cos Vale's lurking shadows, they faced them as a united front, with an unspoken coordination he hadn't known in his previous alliances. As they traversed the labyrinthine caverns, a silence settled, broken only by whispers and the faint sounds of movement in the shadows. This silence was different. It wasn't the oppressive quiet of abandonment. Instead, it was a focused, almost intimate stillness, as if they all understood the danger but trusted in each other to navigate it. Karen felt oddly comforted by it, though he never admitted aloud. After a time, one of the humans spoke up. "You're different from what the rumors said." Her voice was low but held in unmistakable respect. "They painted you as a tyrant, cold, and ruthless. But that's not what I see." Karen looked at her, surprised, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. A tyrant? Had he truly come across that way? It was true he'd pushed his allies hard, demanded the best, and accepted nothing less than total loyalty. But had that made him cold? "I led as I was taught to lead," he said finally. "With strength. To show weakness would have invited betrayal." He hesitated, a rare vulnerability creeping into his voice. "And yet, they betrayed me anyway." The young woman nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes strength isn't what keeps people loyal. Sometimes it's letting others see you as, well, as a person." Her words lingered, stirring something raw within him. He had always believed that respect was earned through power and intimidation, that only by standing above others could he secure their allegiance. But as he looked at these humans, at their open expressions and the ease with which they trusted one another, he realized he might have missed something vital all along. They pressed on, the weight of his thoughts mingling with the constant threat around them. The Cos Vale's influence thickened in the air, a palpable darkness that whispered fear and despair. But the humans remained resolute, showing no signs of faltering. He began to understand that their bravery didn't stem from ignorance. They fully grasped the danger. It was a conscious choice, not a lack of awareness. At one point, they encountered a narrow passage, and Karen's old wounds flared with pain as he struggled to keep up. He expected them to push forward, to leave him to fend for himself. Instead, two of them paused, moving to support him without a word. He was unaccustomed to this, aid given freely, without any expectation of repayment or gain. And yet, they treated it as natural, as if helping each other was simply the way things were. One of the humans, noticing his surprise, gave a half-smile. "You're not used to this, are you?" He shook his head. "Among my people, strength is solitary. We are trained to stand alone." The human's smile softened. "But that doesn't mean it has to be that way, does it?" Karen couldn't answer, but the question echoed in his mind. The Draken valued independence, believing that only the strong could lead. Yet here he was, supported by these humans who did not measure strength in solitude but in connection. It was a startling realization, one that forced him to confront his own limitations. As they continued, he felt a shift in himself. He was no longer simply relying on them out of necessity. He was beginning to trust them. It was a foreign sensation, unnerving but oddly comforting. He had spent so long viewing others with suspicion, expecting betrayal, that he had never allowed himself to trust anyone fully. But these humans, they had given him no reason to doubt them. When they came to a larger chamber, the group paused, assessing the way forward. It was then that Karen noticed a faint noise, a low, shuffling sound, unmistakably the approach of Cos creatures. The humans tensed, each instinctively taking up a defensive position around him, creating a makeshift shield. They were protecting him, their backs exposed to danger, trusting him to cover them if the need arose. He felt a surge of something unfamiliar, a fierce protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't duty, nor was it the pride he had felt with his Draken warriors. It was something deeper, something he thought himself incapable of feeling. In that moment, he understood that these humans weren't just rescuing him. They were inviting him to be part of something larger than himself, something built on mutual respect and trust rather than dominance. When the Kos creatures attacked, they fought as a unit, each human covering the other's blind spots, anticipating each other's moves with an ease born of deep trust. Karen found himself swept into their rhythm, his instincts aligning with theirs almost naturally. He fought not as a king but as an equal, his actions blending seamlessly with theirs. As the last creature fell, he realized he was breathing heavily, not from exhaustion but from the thrill of fighting alongside people who trusted him. It was a strange, exhilarating feeling, one that made him feel more alive than he had in years. Afterward, as they regrouped, one of the humans turned to him with a grin. "Not bad for a warrior king. You might make a decent human one day." He chuckled, a sound he hadn't made in longer than he could remember. The idea was absurd, yet it touched him in a way he hadn't expected. For the first time, he felt like he belonged, not because he was feared, but because he was valued. It was a feeling he hadn't realized he'd been searching for all his life. They resumed their journey, moving with a renewed sense of purpose. The weight of betrayal still lingered, but it no longer defined him. Instead, he felt something else, a strange, liberating lightness that came from knowing he was part of something real, something worth protecting. At some point, he turned to the woman who had first spoken to him. "I've led many, but I've never trusted them. I thought power meant solitude. I thought fear was the only way to lead." She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Leadership isn't about standing above everyone. Sometimes it's standing with them. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let yourself be vulnerable enough to trust." Her words resonated with him in a way he couldn't deny. For so long, he had believed that his strength lay in his independence, in his ability to face anything alone. But here, surrounded by humans who had risked everything for him, he realized he had been wrong. True strength wasn't about standing apart. It was about standing together, about allowing himself to be vulnerable enough to form connections. By the time they reached the final stretch of their journey, Karen no longer saw these humans as mere rescuers. They were his allies, his comrades, and for the first time, he felt a loyalty that wasn't driven by fear or obligation but by genuine respect. In their eyes he saw something that he had never found in any battlefield or coalition, an unwavering faith that went beyond rank, beyond power. And as they continued on, he knew he would fight for them just as fiercely as they had fought for him. They reached the edge of the Kos Vale's lair, where the air seemed charged, alive with the presence of the parasitic force that had plagued them for so long. Karen felt the familiar tension of battle building within him, but this time, something was different. The humans beside him stood with a quiet intensity, not looking to him for orders but prepared to stand as equals, trusting that he would have their backs as they'd had his. He felt a shift inside, a sense of purpose more powerful than anything he had felt in his years as a warrior king. He wasn't fighting merely for survival or conquest, nor for his pride or the honor of the Draken. He was fighting for something larger, something he could only describe as loyalty, not to an empire or a cause, but to these individuals who had shown him a strength he hadn't known existed. They were his allies not because he had commanded it, but because they had chosen it. As they advanced, Karen took the lead without hesitation, but this time, he moved with a different kind of authority, one that came from knowing he was part of a team. The humans matched his pace, their eyes alert, their bodies attuned to each other in a way that felt almost instinctive. For the first time, he felt he was leading not from above but alongside them, part of a unified whole. Ahead of them, the shadows grew denser, coalescing into the dark, writhing figures of the Kos. The creatures moved like a singular, nightmarish entity, their forms shifting and merging as they closed in. But Karen felt no fear, not with these humans by his side. Instead, he felt a fierce determination, a desire not only to survive but to protect the bonds he had forged with these people who had risked everything for him. The battle was brutal, chaotic. The Kos were relentless, but the humans moved in sync, each step purposeful, every strike calculated. Karen matched them, his every action guided not by pride or fury, but by the quiet, resilient strength he had learned from them. He felt himself fighting not as an isolated warrior but as part of something living, breathing, a force that was more powerful than any weapon. At one point, the young woman he'd come to trust stumbled, a Kos creature lunging for her exposed side. Without thinking, he stepped in, his arms swinging in a fierce arc to drive the creature back. She glanced up, a flash of gratitude in her eyes, and he nodded, feeling an odd warmth in his chest. It wasn't pride, it was a quiet, steady satisfaction, a realization that he was finally fighting for something that mattered. Together, they pushed forward, each step drawing them closer to the heart of the Kos Vale. The creatures tried to overwhelm them, but the humans and Karen fought with an unyielding spirit, their movements fluid and synchronized. In that moment, he understood what he had missed all these years, the true power of unity, of fighting not out of fear or necessity, but out of a shared commitment, a trust that went beyond words or commands. As they neared the core of the lair, Karen felt the oppressive weight of the Kos's influence pressing down on him, a darkness that threatened to consume everything. But then he looked around, saw the humans standing firm, their faces set with determination, and he felt a surge of resolve. They had come all this way, defying every odd, simply because they refused to abandon someone they barely knew. And in that moment, he realized that he would give everything he had to protect them, just as they had protected him. They reached the heart of the Vale, a dark, pulsing mass that radiated a sense of pure malice. The Kos seemed to shift, sensing the threat, and the creatures swarmed toward them in a final, desperate attack. But Karen and the humans stood their ground, moving as one, each strike coordinated, every movement fueled by a purpose larger than any of them individually. In the midst of the battle, he found himself facing the central core, the heart of the Kos Vale itself. He felt its dark energy, its relentless hunger, and for a moment, he understood the price of victory. This wasn't just a battle for survival, it was a battle for the very essence of what he had learned from these humans. They had taught him that strength lay not in power or fear, but in the courage to trust, to protect, to fight for something beyond oneself. With a roar that came from the deepest part of him, Karen surged forward, channeling every lesson, every bond, every spark of humanity he had learned into his final strike. His weapon met the core, and he felt the energy surge through him, a torrent of dark and light colliding, battling for dominance. But he held firm, drawing strength from the humans who stood beside him, from the unity they had forged in the face of impossible odds. The core shattered, a blinding light erupting from within as the Kos Vale disintegrated, its energy dissipating into the air like smoke. The humans staggered back, exhausted but victorious, their expressions a mixture of relief and triumph. Karen looked at them, his own heart pounding with a pride he had never felt before, not the hollow pride of conquest, but the deep, fulfilling pride of knowing he had fought for something real, something worth sacrificing for. As they made their way out of the lair, the weight of his past decisions pressed on him, but it no longer felt like a burden. Instead, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a desire to lead not as a tyrant, but as a warrior who understood the true value of loyalty and trust. He knew he would return to his people a changed leader, no longer demanding loyalty through fear but earning it through respect. The young woman caught his eye as they walked, a small smile playing on her lips. "Not bad for a warrior king. You fought well, and you led even better." He inclined his head, humbled in a way he hadn't thought possible. "I've learned from the best," he replied, and he meant it. These humans had shown him a strength that went beyond power, a strength that lay in vulnerability, in connection, in standing together even in the face of insurmountable odds. As they left the Kos Vale's lair behind, Karen felt a sense of clarity, a vision for a new future. He would return to the Draken and tell them of what he had learned, of the humans who had saved him not through fear, but through compassion and bravery. He would rebuild, not as a ruler standing above, but as a leader standing beside those who followed him. For the first time, he felt a sense of peace, knowing he was no longer alone. He was part of something greater, something enduring. And as he walked beside the humans, he understood that true strength wasn't measured by power or fear, but by the courage to trust, to protect, and to fight for the bonds that made them whole. And in the end, He knew he would carry that strength with him for the rest of his life.